Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kirsten Shirk. I am the Communications Director at FP 2020. It is a real pleasure to have you here this morning. Many of you may have joined us yesterday for the celebration of FP 2020, our partnership, the launch of the progress report, and stepping off into the next phase of our partnership. This morning, we're doing a deeper dive into the progress report itself. Not only is, as FP 2020 draws to its transition point, obviously this year, we are not only looking at 1 year as we normally do in the progress report, we're actually looking also at 8 years. In addition, you can understand that we are also looking at the impact of COVID. That has really transformed not only access to family planning generally, but also our ability to measure access to family planning. It's been a heck of a year. Joy, if I can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Oops, sorry, I thought we had the agenda between there. Thank you, that's what I was looking for. So joining us this morning is Adam Wexler from the Kaiser Family Foundation, Jason Bremner, the Director of Data Performance Management here at FP 2020, Beth Schlachter, our Executive Director, who will start us off, Martin Smith, who is also our Managing Director at FP 2020, and Emily Sonneveld from Track 20. These are truly the brains behind this report, and it's been an incredible work to pull this all together and really think about what we've learned and how we've learned it. So Beth will start us off in looking at the big picture of the year as well as of the partnership. Jason will look at, and Emily will talk about what we really learned, what the data tells us. And Martin and Adam will get into the financing, and then we'll go back to addressing how COVID has affected what we know now. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to Beth and into the next slide, please.
Thank you, Kirsten, and welcome to everybody. Not sure if anybody was on this call was able to participate in yesterday's event. If so, we welcome you, of course, to both, and apologies for any repetition, but wanted to take a moment to look, as Kirsten said, a lot more deeply into the report. So we'll start with that. So as everybody knows, Family Planning 2020 was launched with the simple premise that every woman and girl, no matter where she lives, should have the information and ability to use life-saving, life-changing modern contraception if and when she would like to do so. The leaders who gathered in London at the summit in 2012 agreed on our ambitious goal and a very tight time frame for delivering it. The additional 120 million women and girls to be able to use modern contraception in the world's 69 lowest income countries by 2020. That 8-year initiative has now drawn to a close, and we're entering the next phase of the partnership. We all are very aware that we didn't reach the 120 million, but we did bend that curve of progress upward. The FP 2020 initiative has become a movement, really tapping into the decades of work that had preceded us, but now with over 130 governments, foundations, multilateral, civil society organizations, youth-led organizations, private sector partners, everyone is collaborating to advance rights-based family planning. Dozens of countries have strengthened or expanded their family planning programs over the last 8 years, providing millions of women and girls with access to modern contraception that they want and need. Together, we've cultivated a global community of practice that's grounded in data and evidence and guided by the principles of human rights. So that's the story that we tell in this final FP 2020 progress report. As Kirsten said, the arc of progress. We'll also tell the story of how in the past year, the family planning community has faced that greatest threat, the COVID-19 pandemic, and how partners all over the world have worked heroically to maintain services. And then we'll look ahead at what comes after FP 2020, which is now what we launched yesterday, the FP 2030 partnership that we hope will be smarter, stronger, more inclusive, and built to take us through the next decade. So next slide, please. Since 2012, we're happy to announce that 60 million more women and girls have been reached by the FP 2020 partnership. That's an additional 7 million in the last year alone. Gains in terms of additional users of contraception since 2012 are almost 30% above that historic trend line. This contraceptive use has an incredible impact on the lives of women and girls. And as a result of modern contraceptive use, 121 million unintended pregnancies, 21 million unsafe abortions, and 125,000 maternal deaths have been prevented in this last year alone. We're seeing signs of improvement as well across the sector, expanding the number of methods that are available to women and girls, which increases the likelihood that they'll be able to choose a method that meets their needs. We're also seeing signs of increased method availability and options for women and girls, from access to a wider range of methods to increasing options for self-care. In addition, we're seeing an increase in the financial resources that are available for family planning. This year's report, and Martin and Adam will talk about this, highlights the progress that countries are making toward their financial commitments, and also shows that spending on by family planning donors is the highest since the beginning of the Family Planning 2020 partnership. Okay, next slide, please. So again, when FP 2020 was launched in 2012, it was a moment where global attention to family planning was at a low point. The idea behind FP 2020 was to jumpstart progress, bringing all family planning stakeholders together: countries, donors, manufacturers, research community, implementing partners, civil society, to break through the long-standing barriers in the field and generate expansive new momentum for family planning. The initiative was compressed into a timeframe of 8 years, but it was 8 years that was filled with, we think, incredible progress. As we now move forward into the next phase of the partnership, it's time to take a step back and look at what we've achieved. So we created a timeline from 2012 to 2020 that offers a step-by-step walkthrough of key events and initiatives that happened. We're going to continue to build on this timeline and add to it. And we hope others will share as well things that they feel are relevant to the content and the context of the last 8 years. And again, this is the legacy of FP 2020 that we'll build the FP 2030 partnership on. So next slide, please. Okay. Sorry, moving my own notes, a little clunky. Okay, the emergence of the global COVID pandemic, we all know, posed an immediate threat to many of the family planning community's hard-won gains, but the response of the global community was swift and comprehensive. Partners around the world, from the largest multilaterals to the smallest grassroots organizations, have rallied to protect family planning as an essential service. At FP 2020, a few of the things that we did to help support that was to issue a statement early on in April calling for family planning to be an essential service in COVID response. That was echoed by the WHO, and the UN Secretary General also made similar calls to ensure that access to contraception was maintained. We know that that's been a problem, and Jason's going to share a lot more of the data around that as well. We also created a resource center at FP 2020 to help everybody know what was working in other countries and to also track the impact of this. We did see a lot of response to that, particularly through focal point workshops that we held over the summer and in the fall, where countries were able to share their response plans, talk about challenges, and raise those up to funders and donors as well, so there could be more collective learning and a stronger and smarter response across. And then Jason and his team, and many of you on the call, helped to launch as well a family planning data measurement process as well to track that impact. And that's why we're able to share today more of the direct data about the response itself. Next slide, please. So building on, again, the last 8 years of progress and strengthened by the difficult trials of this last year, we're now ready to launch and start the new FP 2030 partnership. And I'll share a few more details about that in just a moment. But we wanted to be clear that this mandate was one that everybody in the community helped to craft and contributed to over what's been basically a 2-year process of consultation and transition. That, of course, was drawn out even further because of the COVID pandemic, making 2021 for us really this year of change and transition, where we're asking countries to make their commitments at a time that works best for them. And we have about 20 countries that are ready now to be making commitments, but many more want to be able to assess what the impact of COVID has been on their financing, on donor financing, on the partnership with many other stakeholders in country, and to then calibrate what they feel their goals and priorities should be in these coming 5 years. So that's why we've as well decided that 2021 will be this year of transition for the structure of the partnership. So next slide, please. One of the things that I think was really important that came through is that the spirit of innovation and progress that was core to FP 2020 is having a direct impact even during this pandemic. We've seen consistent progress on reproductive health over the years that we believe must continue and will require a collective global response. So as we transition this global architecture of FP 2020, we want to make sure that it's with an eye toward impact at the country level, and that the changes we make are calibrated again there to ensure that the partnership itself is more in touch with what's happening in countries and better able to respond to that. So here are some of the fundamental changes that you'll see with FP 2030. Next slide, please. In 2012, we decided to focus on the 69 lowest income countries. With the new partnership, the partnership will be open to all countries who wish to make a commitment. We will calibrate the level of response and support based on the country's needs themselves, focusing on those whose family planning journey still has the farthest to go, but really leaning into the opportunities to have a more global advocacy community around family planning. Where this is really critical is particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, where there's been a backsliding of family planning progress, and advocates there are asking to be a part of this global partnership because they think there's opportunities for shared learning, but also because that advocacy environment is so critical to address teenage pregnancy and to ensure that we're reaching Indigenous populations who are sort of hidden by the numbers when you look country by country in terms of MCPR. So we are again, going to be open to that broader community, but prioritizing the response accordingly. So we'll have 5 hubs around the world. This map is meant to be general, not specific, as I think dots in the ocean might indicate. But we'll have hubs in Latin America and the Caribbean, or 1 hub each in Latin America and the Caribbean, 1 in West and Central Africa, 1 in East and Southern Africa, in Asia, and then a hub for North America and Europe. And each of these hubs will work with the communities in their region. The secretariat that you know will be drawing down to a smaller group, continuing to work on things such as communications, data, global advocacy, but really supporting the entire network of hubs in a much more holistic way. The hubs themselves will launch, we hope, this summer with a bidding process for organizations to host them in each of these regions. And then we will be setting up a governance board that's much more holistic as well and clear in its authorities. So you'll see that the reference group in our core convener structure this year will wind down and morph into this governing board that will include much more shared decision-making and authority across. And it will also have designated seats for partner countries, for advocates, and for youth advocates as well. So we're excited to see what that changing process will bring. And again, all of this will be building up across this year. And we hope launching by ICFP in November, should they be able to host that, if the COVID-19 pandemic is under control at that point. But in any case, we'll get this work done throughout the year as well. Next slide, please. So what's different about the partnership? I think I described some of this already. But again, what we're really hoping the outcome of this is a partnership that's better able to respond to the moment that we're in as well. with all of the change and turmoil and all the incredible issues that were brought forward this last year with regard to economic justice, racial justice, and how it is that development partners exist in this world. Many of the conversations around power dynamics that came into these decolonizing development conversations, we've wanted to be a part of, and we hope that this shift reflects as well. I announced yesterday, for example, that I'll be stepping down from FP 2020 by the midpoint of this year, and we're starting a global search in the coming weeks for the next executive director. We hope will be from one of the partner countries, again, to better reflect this shift in development and within this partnership as well, so that we will have hubs that are staffed by people from the region. The partnership will be led by someone who is from one of the countries where we're hoping to accelerate this progress. And again, that will shift these power dynamics within this governing board. We'll see how that goes. It's an ambitious agenda and one that is new to many of the partners here, including to the donors themselves. So the goals there, I think, are really achievable, but the behaviors within the process will have to change from our own secretariat and the core conveners all the way through to partner countries. So we're very happy to help get this started. I'm excited to help make sure that that transition goes smoothly. And we'll hope that, again, we maintain the core of FP 2020 while we build this more inclusive, different style of a partnership going forward. So with that, I'm going to end on a slide just about navigating the report itself. It is an online report, but we're going to be printing a smaller condensed version in the coming weeks, probably able to share that at some point in March. As you all know, the data tables and the data and information are available there for you to use. There is a special section on COVID-19. We've updated each of the country pages with the data that comes from Track 20 partners. So you can now see that progress on data from 2012 through July of last year. And there are many other features that make it, we hope, more usable and interactive as well. You can download the graphics and estimate tables, and you can share highlighted text directly from the report into your social media. So we hope that you'll be pulling from that, using it, and sharing with us what you think about the usability and what we can do to make it more interactive and usable in the years to come. So with that, happy to hand over to Jason now to walk through the data. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Beth. Next slide, please. We'll stay on that one for a second. So we've got lots to cover today. We've got 4 of us who will all be presenting data, and well, all of us want to cover lots. So I'm really grateful to see so many of you participating. And this is usually the point where I thank all of the partners who contribute to family planning, monitoring, and progress reporting efforts, starting at the clinic, depending on countries, and culminating in the global progress report. I'm going to keep it quicker and just say thank you to everyone and to all of you who play a role in monitoring family planning progress. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, FP 2020, through a consultative process with measurement experts, the Performance Monitoring and Evidence Working Group established a results framework and a set of quantitative metrics, which we call the core indicators, to help countries and the global community track progress annually across diverse dimensions of a family planning program. This has always been a work in progress, and it has evolved over time, adding and adjusting indicators. And just to say, this is the last look that you will have at the FP 2020 results framework. The PME working group has been working hard towards an updated framework for the 2030 partnership, and many of the core indicators will remain the same, and we anticipate the same data process, but we look forward to a new year ahead, and we also look forward to, in the coming years, addressing continuing measurement challenges in the next measurement framework. So next slide. At the outset of 2020, we knew it would be a challenge to present a complete picture of progress over the 8 years of the partnership. That's because while we develop estimates each year, and they're included, in this year's report based on a July or midpoint of last year. The data that inform those estimates largely comes from household, facility surveys, and service statistics from the previous year. That's because the data process, as you can see here, starts in the beginning of the year, and we're only able to include those things that have been collected, analyzed, and reported. And so we knew in 2020 that only some countries would have had a recent survey, and that a complete accounting of progress from 2012 to 2020 would probably take a few years. Well, the emergence of COVID-19 presented new challenges to monitoring and reporting. And although data are beginning to emerge on the impacts, and we'll talk about those later, the data in the core indicators does not reflect the impact of COVID-19. So what we're really getting a glimpse at right now in what we present to you today is where we were with progress prior to the onset of the pandemic, and then we'll look towards what data we have more recently on the impacts of COVID. So next slide. So as Beth mentioned, the core indicators data can be found on the FP2020 progress report website, the Data Hub, as well as the Track 20 websites. I encourage you to explore those resources. I'm not going to cover 18 core indicators for 69 countries today. We're just going to cover some highlights, and we're going to try to focus on some key points of change. So let's dive right in and start to look at the core indicator estimates. Next slide, please. Accelerating progress towards meeting the contraceptive choices of women and girls has been at the heart of the FP20 goals. And let's start by looking at the ambitious goal of reaching more women and girls. So next slide. So I hope you're familiar with this graphic. We've used it once or twice. Its graphic shows the total number of contraceptive users by year across all of the 69 FP2020 countries. You can see on the left side of the graphic that in 2012, there were approximately 260 million users of modern methods of contraception. And in each subsequent year, you can see in the upper line, the red line, that the total number of contraceptive users has grown. And at the midpoint of 2020, we estimated that 320 million women and girls were using modern methods of contraception across the 69 countries. So comparing 2012 to 2020, you can see that we reached 60 million additional users of contraception. Now that's approximately half of the ambitious goal of 120 million. Now during this period, the population of women of reproductive age was also increasing, and actually increasing by approximately 15 million women each year. So just keeping up with more women of reproductive age and more women desiring services means that many more women and girls each year are going to need contraceptive services. So in most FP 2020 countries, in addition to the growth in women of reproductive age, we're seeing growth in modern contraceptive prevalence. And so we're going to look more deeply at pace of change in contraceptive prevalence in the next slide. So as part of their FP 2020 commitments, we have 47 countries who have established goals of increasing contraceptive prevalence through voluntary family planning. Almost all of those set a target of growing MC or MCP, we're calling it this year, modern contraceptive prevalence. We can talk later about why I would drop that R. This graphic shows weighted regional averages in annual percentage point change in modern contraceptive prevalence across the regions of Eastern and Southern Africa to the left there, and each subsequent region you can see over to Eastern and Central Asia. The green line shows the average annual growth for all FP 2020 countries. And you can see that if we were to look back at that last graphic on additional users, that really that progress is differential across the regions. And a large part of this difference can be attributed to where countries started. Now, we've shown you the S-curve, and I think on the next slide, try to show that, we'll show that many of the countries in Asia or regions of Asia had higher contraceptive prevalence, and growth has been slower, while growth has been much faster in those countries that started off with lower levels of contraceptive prevalence. So we're seeing, again, growth in contraceptive prevalence and also growth in women of reproductive age. And each of these is contributing to the growth in demand for services. You really have to look at this at a regional and a country level to better understand progress. I want to just bring forth a couple of country milestones in the next graphic, as well as regional. And looking in particular at the growth in Africa, I think it's really impressive to see that modern methods of contraception in Africa have grown, at least among the FP2020 focused countries, which is most of them, have grown by 66% since 2012, from 40 million to more than 66 million women and girls using a modern method. This growth was most pronounced in Central and Western Africa, where the number of contraceptive users actually doubled in just 8 years, and in Eastern and Southern Africa, where the number of users grew by 70%. In 13 countries, the actual number of contraceptive users doubled since 2012, and 14 countries have each gained more than 1 million additional users of modern contraception. So these increases are a sign that health systems and service providers are doing more than just keeping pace. They have been expanding services. And Emily will look more deeply at this progress and ways of looking at this progress in the next several slides. So we could advance to the next slide. I want to turn it over to my colleague, Emily Sonneveld, director of the Track 20 project at Avenir Health, to really look more deeply at ways that we can assess this progress. So next slide, and over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Jason. Hopefully many of you have already noticed that each year we include analyses in the report, in the annual report, that are in addition to reporting on the core indicators. And this really gives us an opportunity to highlight how countries are using data and the different analyses that are being done to increase our evidence and our knowledge about how family planning programming is progressing. So this year, since it's 2020, we had the opportunity to look at progress during the entire FP 2020 initiative from 2012 to 2020 in a few ways. And the analysis that I'm going to share in just a minute is a brief introduction to what's in the report and what's being done overall by many partners to better understand progress between that whole period. So I think my job here is to get you excited about reading the report and the other analyses that will be coming your way. So we're going to look at a few graphics that try to answer the questions that you see on the slide here. And these questions are looking at, did FP 2020 commitment-making countries grow faster than non-commitment making countries? So that's a question that we get asked a lot. Did countries reach higher levels of MCP than expected? And if yes, how unexpected was their increase? And then the third one, is there an increase in women who have ever used family planning, even if they're not currently using family planning? So basically that's trying to get at, have we expanded the cadre of women who are family planning users at some point in time? So we're just going to take a quick dip into the pool of some of these answers, and there's certainly a lot more information and data that needs to be shared to fully respond to the questions, but just to give an idea of what we're looking at. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So this first graphic is going to be the most detailed of all of them. So stay with me for just a few minutes. It's going to get a little bit less busy on the slides in just a second. We're going to start by looking at Asia, and then the next slide is going to show a graphic for Africa that's showing the same concept, right? And this graphic is to determine if FP 2020 commitment-making countries are growing faster than other countries in the region. And to do this, we need to start by dividing countries into a few groups. right? So first we have to divide them into FP 2020 commitment making countries, which are green in this graphic. FP 2020 non-commitment making countries, so still part of that 69 group that Beth referred to, but they haven't made a commitment to the initiative, and those are in purple in this graphic. And then any remaining non-FP 2020 countries in the region, which are in blue. So that's our first grouping. But then second, we actually also need to then group them by starting levels of MCP, so what their MCP was in 2012. And this goes back to what Jason just talked about, which is where countries lie on the S curve, right? We have different expectations of growth depending on their level of prevalence. And so we want to make sure that we take that into account. So in this case here for Asia, we've divided countries into 4 groups, and those are listed there at the bottom. And the circle represents the average growth rate for each group. And then the line above and below it represents the range of the growth rates for all countries in that group in that level of MCP. And then the country listed at the top of the green line is the fastest growing FP 2020 commitment making country at that level. So here for the Asia countries, we have a bit of a mixed picture when we look at FP 2020 commitment making countries. They seem to be growing faster in the middle categories of MCP, so the 2 middle boxes, but not at the lowest and the highest prevalence ranges, right? But of course, we do see some success stories such as Myanmar and Laos, which you can see those results at the very top of the green lines in the middle 2 boxes. But overall, the response to that question about whether or not commitment making countries are growing faster is varied in Asia. If we go to the next slide and look at that same concept here for commitment making countries in Africa, we have a bit of a different story. So in this case, where the prevalence groups are divided into 5 different levels, right? So we have 5 groupings now instead of just the 4 because the range of prevalence is wider, larger in Africa. So at all level of prevalence, except for the highest, the commitment making countries are growing faster, right? So that green line, that green average is higher than the other 2 grouping. And this really reflects the success that African countries have had over the past 8 years that Jason just referred to. And it really shows that the commitment making countries have indeed outpaced growth compared to the other groups. And some countries, such as Mozambique and Malawi, which you see at the top of their lines in their respective categories, have vastly outperformed the other countries that fall into their category. Of course, when looking at this analysis, we have some caveats that are kind of important. One of them, of course, is that some of the groups don't have a lot of countries. And so you can see here in 2 of the groups, the categories from prevalence between 10 and 20 and 30 and 40. There's only 1 country who's not an FP 2020 country, right? So that's that little blue circle that has no line, right? So we don't have a lot of comparison. So as we further explore this analysis, we can dive into that in more depth and make sure that the groups that we're comparing are reflective of real differences between the countries. Next slide, please. So this next slide is answering the question of whether countries grew to a higher MCP than we anticipated in 2012, and what was the likelihood that they would reach their current 2020 estimated levels. So basically, how different are the 2020 MCP estimates that we calculated with pre-2012 data compared to the estimates that we calculated with all of the current data that's available. So taking a look at this table, the first column shows the 2012 MCP estimate. This is where we get started. The second column shows the MCP estimate among married and women in 2020, but only using survey data that was collected prior to 2012. So with all of the information that we knew back in 2012, what did we estimate their 2020 MCP would be? And then the next column, the third one, actually shows the current 2020 MCP that's available in this year's report that's calculated using all of the data that we have available now. Right? And then that last column, the fourth one, shows the probabilities for achieving that 2020 MCP given what the trends were at the time of 2012. So the 9 countries that are included in this table are the ones that only had a 1 in 4 chance or a 25% probability of reaching their estimated actual 2020 MCP. Right? So these countries were actually able to bend the curve, to change their trend and accelerate progress beyond what was predicted. And again, I want to point out just Mozambique here, which over the 8-year period increased their prevalence from 14 to 36%. And based on what we knew in 2020, that was extremely unlikely to have happened. So it really reflects the level of effort that the country has put into improving and changing and expanding their family planning program. I also want to note that all countries with a less than 25% probability of reaching their estimated 2020 MCP are in Africa. We have a good representation from both the East and the West, so we have a lot of variation. We also have representation from varying levels of MCP, right? So we have countries that started in 2012 with low, medium, and even high MCP, and they still were able to see unexpected growth rates, right? Showing that growth started, maintained, and continued across the full continuum of the S-curve. Next slide. All right, so for countries where fertility intentions remain high and family planning is used primarily for child spacing, looking at the proportion of women of reproductive age who have ever used contraception in addition to the proportion that are currently using contraception provides us with a more complete picture of family planning use, right? So in high fertility countries where women are primarily using contraception to space births on a path to having large families, a large percentage of women who are surveyed at any given point may have temporarily stopped using contraception in order to get pregnant, or they're currently pregnant. So in this context, an increasing proportion of women who have ever used contraception suggests that more women can and do access and use contraceptives when they want and need them, and ultimately hoping that this is leading to more women being able to fulfill their personal fertility intentions, right? Which is everyone's hope. So if we focus on the 7 countries that have a total fertility rate over 5, the changes among women who have ever used contraception are higher than changes in current use in all of these countries. And this table is showing the changes for both all women and married women. And particularly important are the countries where both current and ever use are growing, which is really actually happening in all of the countries with the exception of Nigeria, right? So there's been increases in both married and all women, but you can see if you look at the table that the scale of change is much larger for married women. And really that's reflective that much of the growth is being driven by postpartum family planning services. And so all in all, when taking this together, we do see that there is a larger cadre of women who are using family planning when it's right for them and when they're intending to postpone a pregnancy for some period of time. Okay, next slide. I think that is ending for me, so I will hand back to you, Jason.
Thanks, Emily. So in addition to looking at rates of growth, there are a lot of other sections in the progress report. Just going to try to whet your appetite and encourage you to go look at some of those others, particularly some analyses we've done on changes in contraceptive method mix and an examination of equity in contraceptive use. So next slide, please. This slide we've shown in past years illustrates the cumulative outcome of all the factors involved in each woman's contraceptive choice, and it shows the most common method used by country. So each color here on a country panel represents a method. You can see the color key in the middle of the graphic with female sterilization in blue, IUD in green, implant in yellow, injectable in red, etc. So what we're looking at here is not a complete view of method mix. It is just the most common method used in a country. You can find core indicator 9, contraceptive method mix, in the progress report. I wanted to illustrate this graphic first because it helps us to understand the next graphic. So let's go to the next graphic. And so using those same colors and the most common method, what we have done is to look at the number of countries in which a most common method is injectables, pills, or one of those other methods. And we've done this for 2 survey periods. So what you see here in the upper 2 bars is a comparison of countries and their most common method in 2013 and earlier. And then we've looked at later surveys, so from 2014 to 2020. And we have compared the number of countries with a particular method as the most common method. And in the second lower two bars, we've done that same exercise for the second most common method in each country. And what you can really see here, I hope you see here, is the emergence of a yellow bar there, which prior to 2013 in the countries that we examined, implants were not the most common method in any of the countries. And by 2014 and later, it emerged as the most common method in 5 countries. Perhaps more striking is its emergence as the second most common method, which you can see has really occurred in many, many more countries. So this story of expanding contraceptive use is not just one of number of users, it's also about the choices. And we're going to come back to it, or Emily, I'll talk a little bit more later about the relationship between understanding the growth in contraceptive prevalence and the changes in method mix, which is an ongoing piece of work, but we really can see changes in method mix. So next slide, please. So an important question at the outset of FP 2020 was whether the pursuit of a goal of expanded contraceptive use, or the 120 million additional users goal, might exacerbate inequities or lead to a prioritization of easier to reach populations. So to answer this question, we have begun examining data for signs of inequity in contraceptive gains. And most recently, we were comparing surveys looking at wealth groups, levels of education, age, marital status, and urban or rural residents. Now, this figure illustrates just one of these comparisons, showing the change in modern contraceptive prevalence among wealth groups between 2 survey points. So in every one of these country panels that you can see, the bubbles on the left of each panel represent contraceptive prevalence for wealth groups in an early survey, and the second set of bubbles or circles represents those wealth groups in a second survey. And so in general, we can see an increase or a rise between these 2 surveys, but let's take a look at one country spotlighted in the next slide to better understand this. And here we're looking at just Malawi, and you can see in this close-up the change in the poorest wealth groups, or the blue and green circles, a rise there. And really what you can see between these 2 sets of bubbles on the left and right is a convergence. And what we're seeing is that across countries, there have been gains among the lowest wealth groups and a narrowing of inequity in contraceptive use. Overall, looking at all of those other factors, our results highlight that gains were seen among relatively disadvantaged groups, including rural women, least educated, and poorest women. And it suggests that the importance of country-specific commitments that have focused on reaching disadvantaged populations or on expanding access to family planning really have overcome that initial concern about a quantitative goal. So the next slide, I'll just briefly touch on adolescence in particular. I want to take a final look at change among adolescents. And here what we're seeing is, again, a pairing of surveys, an early survey with a later survey across 21 countries, and looking for change in the adolescent birth rate. Across these 21 countries that had 2 DHS surveys, there are actually 10 countries that experienced significant declines in the adolescent birth rate. But understanding why adolescent births declined and whether it's related to efforts to meet contraceptive needs of adolescents is more complicated and still a work in progress. Many factors unrelated to family planning services and information, including age at marriage, age at first sex, and sexual activity, influence the adolescent birth rate. And we began aggregating the data for all of these factors 2 years ago as a supplement to the adolescent birth rate. And that updated data is available or will be available on the Progress Report website soon. And this is an area that still needs further analysis, but in each country, we encourage partners to look beyond the adolescent birth rate to really understand change. So lastly, I'm just going to turn back to Emily to talk about additional analyses and future work that the Track 20 team and partners are doing to better understand change. Over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Jason. I'll be real quick because I know that we want to get moving. So I think the idea is just to show that this is just the start of the different types of analyses that are being done to look at change over the full 8 years of the initiative, and that all of this is being expanded to give more detail at a regional and a country level. As Jason mentioned, that we are looking at method-specific changes where we can see the extent to which expanding method access, played a part in growth for MCP that we're seeing. And then also looking at the countries who were able to sustain growth over multiple years, some of those high performers that you saw in previous slides, and trying to determine the role of different interventions in that growth. But all of that to say is that there's a lot more to come, and that there's a lot of information that we have available from the 8 years, and we want to make sure that we leverage it all. But one last point before I pass to Martin is that this data is also available online from FP 2020 and from Track 20. And so, we encourage you to use it to do your own analyses and to look at ways that you think that change, to determine how change happened as well. So it'd be nice for sort of everybody to get involved and take a look, but we do promise that more is coming. So thanks very much, and I'll hand over to Martin.
Thanks very much indeed, Emily, and thanks to Jason too. So when FP 2020 was launched back in 2012, the partnership recognized the urgent need for better tracking and monitoring of resource flows in our sector. And an immense amount of work has happened in this area to gain clarity on such important questions as, how much of family planning is funded by domestic governments? How much do international donors contribute? What's the total outlay on family planning, including that out-of-pocket spending by consumers? And we've seen great improvements, as I say, in that FP financing data over time, working with more partners and with greater alignment across those partners in terms of all of our efforts. We've now got 8 years of trend data for bilateral donors, and we really look forward to hearing more from our colleague Adam Wexler of the Kaiser Family Foundation on this in just a couple of moments. The process of tracking domestic government expenditures certainly took longer to establish, but after several years of work and a wide-ranging effort to develop the necessary methodologies to collect, analyze, and validate the data, FP 2020 began reporting domestic government spending on family planning with our 2017-18 progress report. And this year, we have more countries reporting domestic FP expenditures data than ever before. The estimates of out-of-pocket spending have also evolved over the years and continue to be sharpened as more researchers approach the problem. So better data at all levels, including the number of users in each country, the mix of contraceptive methods, private sector prices and subsidies, and the portion funded by government expenditures, are steadily improving the robustness of the estimates that we have. And I'd like to thank the wide range of partners here, including the expert advisory group on international family planning expenditures, for their significant work. So we'll move to the next slide, and I'll just lay out the next few minutes. So this year's report presents our most recent findings, with the caveat, of course, that they relate to 2018 and 2019 expenditures on family planning, and so they do not capture the impact of the pandemic on FP financing. Today, we're going to review firstly donor government funding for family planning, then domestic government expenditures on family planning, core indicator 12, as Jason highlighted earlier. Then we'll move on and talk about estimates of total expenditures on family planning across the 69 FP 2020 countries. So let's talk about donors first. And I'd like to introduce Adam Wexler, Associate Director at the Global Health and HIV Policy Team at the Kaiser Family Foundation. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Beth and Jason and everyone at FP 2020 for the chance to present here today, and welcome to everyone joining in. Before I start, I also want to thank the donor governments whose partnership in this effort make it all possible. So let's go ahead and move forward, and I'll give a brief background on how we got involved in this effort and our methodological approach. Next slide, please. So we started collecting data on donor government funding for family planning following the 2012 London Summit. At that time, we adapted the methodology we've used for many years to monitor donor government spending on HIV. And that's a project we do in partnership with UNAIDS. Our current report presents 2019 funding data, the most recent year available. And as Martin said, this is not capturing the impacts of COVID, but something we'll discuss more later. We now have data available for the period between 2012 and 2019. Next slide. So what are we capturing in this effort? We include funding data from all members of the OECD DAC. We do direct data collection from 10 donors, and that includes Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, the US, and the UK. Together, those donors account for the vast majority of total family planning funding. Data for all other OECD DAC members are from the OECD CRS database. So what are the specific amounts that we're including? We are capturing any earmarked FP designated amount, as well as FP specific contributions to multilateral organizations. So for instance, a donor's contribution to UNFPA supplies would be captured under the bilateral total. We also attempt to capture FP funding provided under other development assistance activities. That's where possible. So 2 points on this data. Some donors, as a matter of policy, do not separate out FP funding from broader reproductive health activities. So by that regard, our funding estimate is slightly high. At the same time, it is challenging to fully understand the extent of funding provided under other development assistance activities. One of the biggest areas of challenge is humanitarian assistance. We can't fully capture the amount being provided there. So by that regard, we know our estimate is slightly low. We're constantly working to improve this methodology and hope to have more in the future. Ultimately, though, the data is validated by the 10 donors from whom data was directly collected. In addition to bilateral totals, we're also looking at donor contributions to UNFPA core resources. So now let's take a look in 2019. What did we find? Next slide, please. Donor government funding for family planning totaled $1.5 billion in 2019, which was essentially flat compared to the prior year, which itself was the highest level of funding since the 2012 London Summit. Among the 10 donors profiled, half increased funding, and that includes Australia, Canada, Norway, Sweden, and the UK, and half decreased funding, which includes Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the US. These trends were the same in currency of origin, except for the Netherlands, which was level compared to the prior year. Next slide. This slide simply shows the trend over to the period we've been collecting data. And what you can see here is that overall funding has increased, though there have been some fluctuations over the period. Now, it's important to note that some of these fluctuations have very specific circumstances. For instance, in 2015, the value of the US dollar increased against all global currencies. So when you take the 2015 total in constant dollars, it was essentially flat. The lower levels of funding in 2016 and 2017 were largely due to declines by the US, but that in and of itself had some specific circumstances as well. And we'll get to that in more detail in another slide coming up in a minute. Next slide, please. The US was the largest bilateral donor in 2019, even after a slight decline compared to 2018, and provided $592.5 million, or 39% of total bilateral funding from donor governments. The UK was the second largest bilateral donor, followed by the Netherlands, Sweden, and Canada. Next slide. This slide simply represents the breakdown for 2019 in total funding by donors. And as you can see here, the 3 donors, US, UK, and the Netherlands, accounted for almost or slightly more than 3/4 of total funding. Next slide. So now to the US context. Each year, the US Congress provides a specific amount of family planning funding, and that is represented by the blue line. As you can see here, each year over the period, the US Congress has provided essentially the same level of funding for family planning activities. However, that funding may be dispersed over a multi-year period. And so what we see is the orange line where disbursements are represented. And we see fluctuations over the period. Sometimes the disbursement is below the actual appropriation, and in other years it's above. This is something we see in all areas of US global health funding. One last point about on this slide, for 2019, a comparable figure for funding dispersed by the US was not available due to adjustments made in USAID's accounting system. Instead, the total for this year is based on the congressionally appropriated amount. Moving forward, we're planning to work with USAID to better understand this amount and update it as more information becomes possible. Next slide, please. So some overall trends. Donor government funding has generally increased, as we mentioned, since the 2012 London Summit, although there have been fluctuations, which we've covered. In 2019, donor government funding was more than 400 million above the 2012 level, which was 1.1 billion. And funding from 7 of the donors profiled, Canada, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, the UK, and the US, was higher in 2019 than 2012. Next slide. What we wanted to demonstrate here is remove the US total disbursements that were displayed. As we can see, they fluctuated over time, and really highlight the funding from all other donors, which is highlighted in the blue line. And what we can see very clearly here is that over the period, funding has increased significantly since 2012, with some fluctuations, but again, the 2015 amount was due to the rise in the US dollar, and we still saw some repercussions of that in 2016. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, we also looked at donor contributions to UNFPA. And so donors support FP activities through contributions to UNFPA's core and non-core resources. Contributions to the non-core resources, as I mentioned earlier, are included under bilateral totals if specified by the donor for FP activities. Contributions to UNFPA's core resources are meant to be used for both programmatic activities, for instance, family planning, HIV, and so on, as well as general operational support. Donors contributed a total of 367.6 million in 2019 to UNFPA's core resources, which was on par with the 2018 amount. Next slide, please. In 2019, Norway and Sweden provided the largest core contribution at approximately $62 million each, followed by Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. In 2019, the US administration invoked the Kemp-Kasten Amendment for the 3rd year in a row to withhold funding, both core and non-core contributions to UNFPA. Now, it's important to note here that in recent years, total donor contributions to core resources has been on the decline. Much of that can be attributed, but not all, to the Trump administration's decision to withhold funding. Now, this may change under the Biden administration, which is likely to reinstate funding for UNFPA. In 2019, UNFPA estimates it spent approximately $398.5 million from core and non-core resources on FP and FP-related activities, an increase of more than $40 million compared to 2018. It's also important to note here that funding disbursed by UNFPA has increased over this period. Next slide, please. We released our report, Donor Government Funding for Family Planning in 2019 yesterday in conjunction with FP 2020's progress report, and we have already started collecting data for 2020. And we will have a big focus on trying to understand what the impacts of COVID-19 have been and are potentially going to be on donor government funding levels. And with that, I'll hand it back to Martin and look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Adam. Excellent to work with yourself and the KFF team, as always. So let's move on and talk about domestic and total expenditures on family planning. And of course, domestic expenditures reflect a government's commitment to its family planning program and indicate the prospects for its long-term financial sustainability. Domestic expenditures are defined as all government expenditures that support family planning including commodity purchases, demand creation campaigns, investments in training and research, and service delivery, of course. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this finance section, it's taken years of work and intensive and wide-ranging efforts from a wide number of partners to establish these methodologies and analyze these expenditures, and then to work with countries on their critical in-country validation processes. We'll move to the next slide. So this is FP 2020's third year of reporting domestic expenditures and the country level, again, as I mentioned earlier. And the number of countries has increased every year. This year's table includes estimates for 54 of the 69 FP 2020 countries, totaling nearly 1.6 billion US dollars in spending. The 54 countries you see here in total represents 96% of the modern method users across the 69 FP 2020 focus countries, and range from over $300 million spent in a year on family planning in India and Indonesia to less than 100,000 US dollars in 5 countries that you see in the table. We'll move on and talk about total expenditures on the next slide. And total expenditures in 2018, that's the most recent year for which most domestic government expenditures are available, are estimated at 4.4 billion US dollars across the 69 FP 2020 focus countries. International donors contributed an estimated 48%, domestic governments 35%, and consumers 17%. In addition to those bilateral donors that we heard on from Adam earlier on, private foundations also contributed substantial and increased resources to family planning over the period, and are included here among the international donors. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation emerged as a critical funder of family planning in the FP 2020 era, and is currently among the top 3 family planning donors. In terms of domestic government expenditures, those 54 countries that I mentioned earlier with available data, 5 countries, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and the Philippines, do account for 82% of the domestic government expenditure on family planning that you can see in this chart. Now, these proportions vary greatly for different countries, of course, and I'll very quickly show 3 examples using 2016 as the comparison year across these 3 examples. And so on the next slide, we can see here in Bangladesh, where we see domestic government expenditure constitutes over 72% of financing for family planning, the largest amount by some margin within Bangladesh's own chart here. We move secondly to Senegal on the next slide, where you can see that 62% of financing for family planning in 2016 came from international donors, with a rising 28% from previous years coming from those critical domestic government resources. And then my third example in showing Indonesia, where out-of-pocket spending by consumers on family planning constituted 42% of total expenditures on family planning in 2016. That was second only to the domestic government spending of 52%. So a wide range of country contexts. We feature these and 5 other country examples in our progress report for your reading and for your analysis. And so we'll move to my final slide. So within our report, within the finance chapter of the annual progress report this year, you'll see a section on the work of the Global Finance Facility. You'll see a spotlight on European donors, a report from the Countdown 2030 Europe project, who actually published their full report also this very week. You'll also see a section on commodity spending from the 2019 Contraceptive Security Indicators report. As we've discussed, COVID-19's impact on family planning financing, there are, of course, significant concerns in terms of pressure on donor governments, pressure on domestic budgets, and the impact on consumers and their ability to pay for services. While it's very, very important, of course, to recognize that great efforts have been expended across a wide range of countries to ensure continuity of funding for family planning. As a community, our hard work to understand and assess that impact on FP financing is underway and ongoing, and will be so for some time. We will be reporting back to you, working with you as we go forwards. And lastly, to say that obviously with the global commitment to achieving universal health coverage, it's clear that the future lies in broadly supported integrated health systems with family planning as a key component. And so very much the crux going forward will be to ensure that UHC services or UHC schemes feature a very strong focus on primary care, including sexual and reproductive health, and that family planning services are emphasized and funded. The methods and procedures that have been developed over the last 8 years of FP 2020 that are described in our annual progress report, in our tracking of resource flows, as well as development of costed implementation plans, using data models to identify feasible goals for countries and all of the necessary investments to reach those goals. These will continue to be essential tools for the next decade of family planning programming, and we're very excited to be working with you all as a community as we go forwards together. And so over to Jason now for more on the section of the progress report that looks at the impact of COVID-19 on family planning. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Martin. So thanks to all of you for sticking with us for so long. We knew it would be a data-heavy presentation, and we really do want to explore some of the impacts of COVID-19 on family planning. I don't think I need to tell any of you that our lives are disrupted in innumerable ways, and the basic building blocks of family planning have been disrupted as well. That's manufacturing of contraceptives, supply chains, the services, healthcare services, and even data systems have all faced challenges. So early estimates of the impact of the pandemic on family planning were basically calls to action in the face of these disruptions. And they involved very general scenarios that were generally applied across all low and middle income countries. And these broad scenarios, while helpful in mobilizing our group and in the incredible response that the family planning community has taken, they're really just a first step. And now we need to move towards the work of really specifically understanding impacts. And that's very much still a work in progress. Next slide, please. Betha mentioned that one of the steps we've taken is to convene and help coordinate among organizations that are measuring impacts. And some of the areas that we've been looking at and where we've been aggregating resources to the FP 2020 data hub and a specific space on COVID are first developing an early assessment of impact on data collections systems, looking at ways that HMIS and other data can be used to assess service impacts. There's a lot of work going on to assess supply chains. And then, as I mentioned, looking at models and scenarios and how partners can be sure to align on those so we're not saying very different things across models and scenarios of impact. Next slide, please. So just turning to the impacts on data systems, I see some of you on the webinar here work in some of these surveys, and I don't need to tell you that the DHS mix large national level surveys have been temporarily suspended or were temporarily suspended in 2020, and in most cases continue to be postponed. So we've lost one of our critical measurement resources for assessing many health outcomes, including the proportion of women using family planning. So it's really not possible at this point to estimate impact on variables or indicators such as coverage. So understanding the impact of COVID requires a creative use of different types of data in the absence of surveys. I'll show a few of these, and then Emily will turn to public sector HMIS. Okay, so next slide. There are some great early reports of impact that you can explore from large private sector providers, including MSI and IPPF. who both have produced reports as early as April last year, looking at, and more recently in June, looking at the first and second quarters. MSI was able to look at their service volume in comparison to what they expected for the first and second quarters. And while they saw overall declines in service volume for family planning and their abortion services that they provide, there were very diverse impacts across countries. So in some countries, particularly in India, they saw very large declines. In some other countries, they actually saw increases as MSI stepped in to support government for providing some services. So it reveals, their report reveals that the impact wasn't as grave as they initially expected, but has been severe. That decline has been greatest in Asian countries, which have experienced extended lockdowns, and less so in Africa, where the lockdowns were shorter and the declines less severe. I think really important finding was that their client base, while it declined, proportionally, adolescents remained the same percentage of their client base. So it didn't seem in their early look that adolescents were disproportionately affected. IPPF has done also some interesting rounds of surveys with their member associations and has found that after early disruptions, services have begun and are now, most member associations are providing a full range of services. The challenges that they face now actually are about adapting their services and about the cost of adapting these services and the cost of PPE. And one of their greatest concerns is the long-term financial solvency due to increased costs and reduced revenue. So I think some complicated challenges ahead that we need to better understand. Next slide. We have other partners who have been able to continue to collect data. The PMA project is collecting survey data in several countries because they had resident enumerators and phone numbers, and they have had some interesting insights. I encourage you to go to their website to look at these. This particular panel just shows the large impact on income and a perceived or feared loss of household and personal income among women. And as Martin mentioned, consumers in many places either pay for services or have to pay for transportation and other factors to get to a clinic. And so we do not yet know what the impact of a loss of income will be long-term on people's use of contraception. And then lastly, partner, next slide, please. Our partners at NIVI were able to take advantage again of a mobile platform with consumers to ask questions about people's experience seeking contraceptives. And in India, what you can see here on the left of these two donuts is that among the women that they were interfacing with, 50% were actually able to get family planning method at a pharmacy within the past month. And there were various reasons why the other 50% faced challenges, prescriptions, stock, closures of pharmacies, and the inability to get there. And looking forward to what they perceived as the challenges of getting a method, their financial situation was actually one of the largest barriers shown here, as well as fear of virus and closures. So understanding all of this will require creative use of data. I'm going to turn back to Emily to look at the public sector and what data might be able to tell us from the public sector. So over to you, Emily.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to move quickly through this so that we don't run out of time. And I was going to show 3 different country examples that are in the FP 2020 report, but maybe I'll just do one and then make sure we have a few minutes at the end and people can take a look at the report if they're interested. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk briefly about the work that Track 20 is doing with service statistics related to COVID. As I'm sure all of you know, service statistics are made up of the data on the number and type of health services being provided. They're available everywhere. but the quality is not equal everywhere. So just an important reminder that anytime we look at this, we need to consider the quality of the data that we're looking at, and how and use that when we're thinking about interpreting the results. So for family planning, countries collect 3 types of data on volume of services provided, either number of users, number of visits, or number of commodities distributed to clients. Countries usually collect 1 or 2 of these, although there are a couple overachieving countries that collect all 3. That's certainly not the norm. And so this is the data that we're using to look at our analysis. Data is available monthly and at multiple levels of the health system, which really provides us an opportunity to identify both short and longer term trends in family planning use, and then to be able to leverage that information to start estimating the impact of COVID-19 on family planning use. So if we go to next slide. The approach that Track 20 is using is to build an Excel-based tool that countries can use directly to look at the trends in their service statistics. It looks at data monthly, but importantly compares them to pre-COVID trends. So this helps us account for any seasonality that we see in family planning services. So for example, if you usually see a spike in services in July, then we need to know that when we're looking at July data to make sure that there's a equivalent spike that we see every year, or that we understand the impact of there not being one. And so just as importantly, my colleague Priya Emmert, who's on this call, is leading this work, and she's doing this with our a previous M&E officer from Afghanistan, who is no longer in Afghanistan, but Sarush Samin, who did the programming. So it's been really nice to pull from the expertise in the field to be able to look at some of this information. So just a few important caveats about using service statistics. So they're focused on public sector services. And although most include some parts of the private sector, that varies. So it's really helpful to look at additional private sector data, like some of the stuff that Jason just showed, at the same time to be able to get the full picture. We also know that there's some potential limitations on reporting during the pandemic, right? So with movement restrictions in place, it's not always possible to enter the data into the system, even if the services are being provided, right? So we need to make sure that we understand that and we know how representative the data is at the of what's actually happening, right? And we found that data lags are quite common, so that the data is continuously changing and being updated. One of the country examples that I've included, although it's not the one we're going to look at, it's for Cameroon, where the data has actually been updated since the report, just to show that there's, that lag continues moving forward. And the other thing is that method mix matters within a country, right? So if a country primarily uses short-acting methods where refills are frequent, the lockdowns and restrictions may have a disproportionate impact if other options for getting supplies out are not available, right? So thinking of all of that within the context. So let's take a look at one of the examples, if we go to the next slide, just so that we can see what the data looks like and sort of what we're presenting and what countries are using to have these discussions. So this is looking at Nepal. And it's looking at just the long-acting and permanent methods. And so what this does is it shows the trend back into 2019 so that we can have an idea of what the trend looks like before COVID. The black dotted line represents March of 2019, so sort of the start of the pandemic, although I know it starts differently in different countries, but just a general idea for you guys to understand sort of the pre and post on the graph. And so what we really see here is, there is a pretty large immediate impact on implants and IUDs, which is and there's permanent methods in this graph too, but the impacts are primarily on implants and IUDs, which are mostly sourced from the public sector, and that represent about 11% of the total method mix, right? And if we did separately look at the HMIS data for the short-acting methods, condoms, injectables, pills, they're not here, but we did look at them, and they really don't show corresponding increases, right, that we would expect if people were sort of switching. So we don't see that, right? But we do see these pretty severe declines. Now, data later in 2020 suggests that there starts to be a recovery, right? So you can see those lines start to spike up, right? The yellow line being implants, you see that start to spike up. And then maybe go down again. So we see a little bit of a mixed pattern, right? Where we have an immediate decline, somewhat of a recovery, and then a decline again. But what's really important to know in this case is that the government in Nepal knows quite well that they are actually having a reporting problem for data, and that this is likely not representative of everything that's being supplied. And so what they did actually quite proactively is build a sort of backup data system where data entry into the system could actually be easier and be done remotely, so that they were making sure that the data that they were getting was actually reflective of the services. And so that took a bit to get up and running, about 6 to 7 weeks or so. But with that now, there is hope that some of this information going forward can better reflect what the services are going within the country. So we're going to just go through the next 2 slides because we're going to run out of slide. This is Cameroon, skip ahead to Liberia, skip ahead. You can look in the report and go 1 more slide. And I think here, just to sort of have a final summary is, what we're really seeing when we look at the public sector data is different patterns, right? We're seeing different patterns that show both impact and recovery are happening differently in pretty much all the countries that we looked at. And there's 3 countries presented in the report, but there's more countries that we've looked at, right? And those countries introduce even more patterns in terms of impact and recovery. There's some countries like Liberia, which we didn't look at, but which you can go back and look at in the report, where there seems to have been a very small impact in the very beginning and then recovery and maintenance, right? So we're not seeing that every country is hard hit, but we are seeing everything from incredibly hard hit to minimal impact. And what we see is that what we take away from this is the differences highlight the need for impact estimates really to be done at the country level, and that making overarching assumptions about health-seeking behaviors is likely to lead either to an over or an underestimation of changes in actual contraceptive use. And also that the government responses vary greatly in terms of the severity and the length of the lockdowns, changes in availability of different types of service delivery, and impact on the supply chain. And so putting those 2 pieces together, health-seeking behaviors and then limitations that are on health-seeking behaviors due to lockdowns is really creating a lot of variation across countries. And I guess maybe my last point before I hand back to Jason is just that this is all still a work in progress. Countries are on a monthly basis processing this data, using this tool to look forward, readjusting their estimates as they get more data in and they have a better understanding of how much data is actually reporting into the system. So more and more of this information will become available as we move forward and work with countries to better understand the full impacts. So I know that was really brief and I apologize, but I wanted to make sure that there was a couple minutes to close. And I know that those country graphics are in the report, but if anybody has any questions, please reach out to us. We're happy to provide more information or a little bit more context if that would be helpful. Thank you, and back to you, Jason.
Thanks, Emily. So it's been a tour de force here of looking through various aspects of data. Thanks for sticking with us. Really appreciate the questions that are that have been answered in the chat. And I'm going to turn, I think, lastly to Kirsten, who might pose a few last questions that we are going to answer live, and we'll go from there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone, for your terrific presentation. As you can see, this year, there was just a lot to wade through, from the scope of the entire partnership to the impact of this year. And it's just been the work that Track 20 and the PME Working Group and Jason and his team have been doing the past 8 months to sort of account for this has been really incredible. We do have a number of excellent questions in the queue. I'm going to start with probably what's the biggest question looking ahead to the next partnership. For Beth, if you can take this, I think you've thought about this a great deal. Will the 120 million additional user goals still be a part of the FP 2030 overall goals?
So I'm going to answer that about the decision, and then I'm going to turn it to Jason to talk a little bit more about nuances within the indicator itself. So we feel very useful to have this overarching goal of additional users, but we also learned throughout the process of the partnership that while that is a galvanizing sort of a political statement to get everybody working in one direction, that it also came with its challenges. And so while we'll continue to work toward that goal, because it is an important goal, we're going to look more holistically in the next iteration of the partnership about all of the things that we hope to achieve with regard to quality, equity, range of services, consistency over time. And so it will remain one of the indicators, but we will no longer identify ourselves solely by that indicator. So Jason, over to you for a little bit more about changes with the indicator itself.
Thanks. So as I mentioned at the outset, the PME working group has been looking at the next measurement framework. And this indicator, which right now we refer to as additional users, will change to the total number of contraceptive users. So we will be tracking the total number of contraceptive users in each country over time. That will allow us to look at changes in the number of contraceptive users. Additional users was always based on a comparison to a point in time, 2012. What's our new framework or our new baseline? We're not going to worry ourselves so much with that baseline, but really just going to provide the tools for people to track the number of contraceptive users over time, which I showed at the outset. And again, we'll be able to track progress towards that original goal, but we'll also be including more countries. And so our base of countries will change over time as well. So lots of interesting and challenging measurement questions ahead, and we will be revealing a new measurement framework in the coming months.
Great. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Beth. Martin, a question for you. In Nigeria, which is a commitment-making country, has gone on to cut back on their committed funds for family planning to almost zero. Do you have plans to engage countries like Nigeria when they do recommit and to commit more funding for family planning?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to Shifa very much for the question. Yes, Nigeria's ambitious domestic financing commitment of 2012 was cut back somewhat in 2017 to $4 million for commodities. And, the country has struggled a bit to live up to that. The contraceptive security indicators show that only 8% of commodities in 2019 came from government sources. So there's clearly a lot of work to do on that road to financial sustainability. Two optimistic points, I think, to raise. One, lots of action happening at the state level. Arguably, that state level financing for family planning is where the domestic engine is going to come from in Nigeria. And lots of political commitment at the federal level, at the senior level from Minister Ehenere and his team, and a very deep engagement with the full Nigeria team around a new commitment to FP 2030 with a domestic financing commitment at the center of it is underway right now, Shifa. So please do get involved. Back to you, Kirsten.
Thanks, Martin. Jason, for you, in the next measurement approach, is there a consideration for measuring contraceptive autonomy, using when you want to use, not using when you don't want to do so? Is that reflected in the indicators? It's sort of critical for underpinning knowing whether use is actually voluntary. How do we measure what is voluntary contraceptive use?
Great question, Megan. It's a huge question amongst measurement folks, which is sort of looking at what does really unmet need tell us, and one of the active conversations among the PME working group is better understanding of dynamics of contraceptive use. And shortly, I anticipate that the PME working group will produce a commentary on some of the challenges of our measures of contraceptive use, particularly unmet need and demand satisfied. Some large changes like the one you're suggesting would require a lot of new data. And I do know that the PMA project is exploring different questions that might get at some of these concepts of what is truly voluntary. One change that we will make is also to document traditional use of methods, or countries where traditional use seems to play an important role in the overall contraceptive prevalence. So in addition to reporting modern contraceptive prevalence, we're going to report a threshold for which at countries that have a large prevalence of traditional use. So a lot of steps that would need to be taken to get there, certainly part of the discussion and work, I would say, of the next 10 years. As I said, the measurement framework's evolving, and this will take a long time.
Thank you, Jason. I think that may be all we have in terms of questions. Last call for anyone who wants to jump in. I want to thank our speakers, our panel speakers, so much. Oh, Jason, did you want to jump in and say something? Go ahead.
Just want to do a plug for you, Kirsten. Kirsten has urged us to do a COVID-19 impacts specific webinar in the coming months to invite all of the partners who are actually capturing this information to a panel. So we would, we'd invite the Track 20 Project, MSI, and other partners to come and present their data, not just what we've aggregated in the project in the progress report. So stay tuned. Coming months, when we've had a chance to rest from this month, we will come back with a more focused data session on COVID-19 impacts, and I look forward to inviting and seeing all of you at that. Thanks, Kirsten.
Oh, of course. Thank you for bringing that up. And while we're at it, I think you should look into, if you want to learn more about how all these pieces come together and the collaboration between FP2020 and Track 20 and the PME working group. We've been developing a series on our measurement learning series. How does this all come together? Why do we measure what we measure? And how is this partnership? How are these partnerships with country M&E officers, with Track 20? How has this really changed the way we measure family planning? And understand how does the data illustrate the rights that we're trying to achieve? So again, thank you all for joining us this morning.
Kirsten, one last.
Oh, yep.
Just to thank everybody again, but also to invite you over the course of 2021 to be a communications partner with us. A process of change, particularly virtually during a pandemic, can be really complicated, and we found it's been a struggle to be able to communicate the changes we're making in a way that people can see themselves in that change, and to also help influence the decisions around what that change will be. So please consider us your partner in that. The door is open. Share with us if you're understanding some of this change, if you need more information, if we can share more effectively about that. We have struggled with that, I think. So we would love to hear from you and help us to land this and get it right. So just wanted to put that last bit in there as well. Thanks, Kirsten.
Thanks,
It's not a comms team challenge, it's a global challenge.
It is a global challenge. We've been wrestling this for a while. And Shifa, I see your comments. Thank you so much. We'll be following up with you. Anyone else? Any last words? Martin? You look like you were going to say something.
No, just thanks so much for the massive effort from our wider set of team, FP2020 team and partners. And the questions and the engagement both yesterday and particularly today has been fantastic. We really, really do appreciate everyone's engagement with us and engagement as being our communication partners, as Beth said, as we move into the FP2030 era. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin. And everyone, really, watching the chat today and yesterday, it's been amazing to be able to be with our global community, even if it's just in a chat. The partnerships and the support is really incredibly welcome, and obviously part of what makes this partnership work so well. So thank you, everyone. Congratulations, team, on a new report. Please be in touch with us over the next year. We'll be providing tools and resources, but also really listening, wanting to hear how this is coming over and how you see yourself fitting into the next partnership. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Thank you all for joining us.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Kirsten.
Sure.
Thanks so much, everyone.